What up, YouTube? Fred is not available, so we have taken over his channel to have a lovely discussion linked to SD Histcon. Welcome all the SD Histcon attendees, and especially people who were just at the demo that I think just finished with David Thompson showing off the game Rebels Against Rebellion. We're not going to talk about that basically at all. No gameplay, none of that. This is pure history and other tedious bullshit that I deem worthy. As I was telling David before, here in South Korea, it is 11 p.m. I've had a few beers, and we're going to have a good time. Also, before we get into the actual topic at hand, first of all, welcome, David.
Thanks.
David Thompson. If you haven't noticed, David Thompson's here. Designer of Undaunted, War Story, Night Witches, other games. And at least I said, normally I would have said that we're going to talk about, Rebels Against Rebellion, your next game. But like, obviously you have like 10 games coming out before this game comes out. So I don't know what that categorizes this game as. Upcoming future David Thompson game. And Trevor Benjamin, who is too expensive for us to get to appear.
Yes.
So it's just David. His rates are obscene. So just David. Before we get to that, happy Pride, everybody. It was Daejeon Pride here in South Korea, which was where I was this morning, and it was great. Only the second one ever, so also a good time there. But welcome, David. Thanks for coming. You've been on before, I assume. I don't watch this channel, but I think you've been on before.
Fred has reluctantly allowed me on before. Yeah.
Very good. And we're going to talk about something you've obviously been dragging your heels on, which is an American Civil War game. Yes. Just taking your time. So this is going to be like not super structured. I think we have some general ideas of things we want to talk about and kind of meander our way through together. And the first one I wanted to kind of step into is like Rebels Against Rebellion is kind of about loyalism and secession from secession, and this idea of people in the South staying loyal to the Union during the American Civil War, or not at least joining the secessionists, how we wanted to find that. I was curious, like, what you felt about that, how that was something that you really wanted to tell in the game, and what your own kind of motives were there.
Yeah, so for me, I mean, I don't want to get into this too much in terms of like my big picture thoughts on the Civil War, but I was born and raised in Savannah, Georgia. So like, growing up in like 70s, early 80s in Savannah, Georgia, the Civil War is like all around you, and you kind of don't know it as a kid. Like you don't really still like fully appreciate all the influences, conscious and subconscious, it has on you. But certainly, I grew up in my direct family, which was very we as you often talk about the sort of lost cause and all of those things that feed into that culture. Like it was everywhere, and I didn't realize it at the time until I got much older and kind of looked back and really thought about it. So for me, the Civil War, like as a topic to read about, to game, all that, has never been something I was super interested in. Just because, I just kind of feel a little bit gross about it in general, right? That's kind of the best way to describe it. And so, So anyway, in terms of the topic of loyalism, the reason that that became a topic of interest to me is it feels to me, and I know this is like reductive and overgeneralizing, but it feels to me like most Civil War games are like operational or strategic in nature, and they kind of boil everything down into either like this, everything's a big sort of pitched battle over a large area, or like an oversimplification at the strategic level about the Civil War. And occasionally you'll have conversations about topics like slavery, etc. But what you never hear about are like these pockets of loyalism in the South that weren't, I want to be very clear about this. These were not people, some of them were, but mostly these are not people who are like anti-slavery and fighting for the cause of slaves to be loyal to the North. These are people who are loyalists for other reasons, oftentimes like their own economic interests, right? And so when you look at a place like East Tennessee in the game, or other places, this Appalachian area of Tennessee, the reason that they were loyalists is, again, oversimplification. It made economic sense for them, for their livelihoods to be loyalists. So anyway, mostly, that was a really long way of saying it felt to me like a very underserved topic. Like,
Yeah.
how many Civil War games are there about Southern loyalists? I don't think there's any. If there are, I'm interested, in reading about them.
Yeah, it's something that I think is really interesting, and something that I think comes up a bit more in more recent discussions about the American Civil War is specifically like a higher level kind of, I don't think higher level is like superior, but like loyalism among like generals and higher ranking individuals. So we talk about like General Thomas, the Rock of Chickamauga is from Virginia, Admiral Farragut, famously damn the torpedoes full speed ahead, Admiral. I think he's originally from Tennessee, but he'd lived in Virginia for like 20 something years because he served in the War of 1812. He was like he had a super long Navy career. It started when he was like 12. So he had like been living in Virginia this whole time. So he was also like very Southern, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Like a Winfield Scott, the first Union commander of the war, is also a Southerner. So you have a lot of these like really high level generals, or in case of like Thomas, mid-level, who then becomes quite a high level general over the course of the war. And so we sometimes hear a bit more about them. I think it used to be you didn't hear about them at all, really. And there's even still, you can hear like this kind of distilled idea of like, if you're from the South, you were naturally sympathetic to the Confederacy, even like modern people, which as someone who's from the South, I personally resent. Like, we're not all on board with this. Like, some of us actually know that slavery is bad. But that kind of like, oh, look at these more important generals, or if you read some more recent stuff about Robert E. Lee, they'll talk about how he was the only member of Virginia of his rank, he was a colonel at the time, who actually defected. But I think what's interesting in Rebels Against Rebellion is that you've really kind of discarded this like top tier, like, the really famous individuals, and are looking at like normal, ordinary people, right? Like, none of these people are generals or even like colonels. These are, or even like captains. These are just like farmers with guns.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean, so for me, that is more of a, when I'm diving into a lot of the topics that I explore in war games, if it's a historic war game, not like an Undaunted or something that's more of abstraction, but like an actual based on the history of a specific event, I very much sort of naturally look to the individuals at like the lowest possible level. And so Rebels Against Rebellion was definitely, I'm way more interested in the farmer who was part of the home guard who was fighting against the Confederates than the general officers, right? There was one colonel who, for about a month, turned the home guard, the county home guard, into a Union regiment that was then smashed, and it went back to basically being a bunch of guerrillas. But really, that's the only proper Union presence in the whole 2 years of rebellion within the county.
Yeah, it's interesting to focus on kind of more the guerrilla aspect as well, which is something that we don't get a lot of in games, I think. And even in wider discussions, like, guerrilla warfare was quite endemic to large parts of the US, and it explains certain things about like the way troops were deployed. Like, you had to maintain control of areas, particularly, I mean, Missouri was rife with it. It's kind of the one, like, famously plagued by like constant guerrilla warfare throughout the war. And then, aside, the only one I can think of that like certainly has any game coverage and maybe has any sort of equal fame is Mosby and Mosby's Raiders, operating in Virginia. Because of course there's the Mosby's Raiders game from Eric Lee Smith, which is a solo game. And so, but that's an interesting can of worms. But like, kind of the only real case I can think of somebody really doing guerrilla, or even like including a lot of guerrilla warfare in games, and even in books, it tends to be shuffled to the side, and if it is included, it's almost all Shenandoah Valley guerrillas, the Mosby's Raiders, and then in 1964, when Sheridan goes into the valley to basically burn it, which was something that was still controversial among some people in my high school. Sheridan burning the valley. I remember some people got very offended once when somebody made a positive reference to it, which had happened.
Yeah, no. So Mosby's Raiders was really the game when I first started down this path, and I was asking people that were ACW gamers and stuff, and it was the only one that people could recommend to me. I mean, I'm not saying it's the only one that exists, but it certainly would be the one of prominence that people knew, and they were like, "Oh yeah, you should try that," because that's the one game I can think of that's even tangentially related to the topic.
Yeah, it's an interesting game. I like Mosby's Raiders fine. It is incredibly old, and it's like vibe. It's got like the tear apart cards, like the really old Avalon Hill. I think it's Victory Games, but like that kind of, you have to like, I got a copy secondhand, so I didn't have to tear the cards myself because I probably would have butchered it. But yeah, like they're not real card stock and stuff. And Mosby himself is a really interesting character in a way because he's one of the kind of infamous scalawags of the post-war era of Southerners who then didn't join in the Lost Cause. And he's not as reviled as Longstreet or Mahone, who are probably the two biggest ones, but Mosby was famously anti-Lost Cause, and after the war would say, "No, I fought that war for slavery. That was what I was there for. Like, I'm not going to deny what my purpose was or what I was doing." And only really became a Lost Cause figure after he died and couldn't speak for himself anymore.
Yeah.
So yeah, he's an interesting, like not a good dude, but an interesting character. I think he was also briefly like the legal attaché to Hong Kong for America, which is wild when I think about this stuff. Weird. When you're like, because you kind of separate these parts of these people's lives. And the American Civil War feels like it happens in a time capsule sometimes, and you forget shit. Like like Mosby went to Hong Kong. Somebody else went to the Ottomans, and like Ulysses S. Grant toured Japan. Like,
that's like, weird.
It's wild stuff to think about, that kind of, those guys have like that existing at the same time. So I wanted to, this is due credit to Mark from War Games to Go, has requested that we insert a long diatribe and meandering discussion about terminology. And this is something that, like, we actually talked a bit about it before, but do you want to talk a bit about like, how do you pick the terms for what you're going to call things in a game like this?
Yeah, that's a really good point. So Mark Johnson, really good friend of mine, pointed out, hey, be careful, because, I was talking to Grant from Pushing Cardboard recently on his podcast, YouTube channel, and about Rebels Against Rebellion. And I just sort of, as I start to talk about it, you forget how confusing things are, right? So we have a state that was seceding, and then we have a county that was seceding from a state that was seceding. So when you talk about secessionists, who are you talking about? And it gets really confusing really fast. And there's guerrillas on both sides, etc. In terms of the game, the actual, and again, this isn't a discussion about the game, but just kind of frame things. In terms of the game, I refer to the Scott County player and the Confederate player. Those are not really accurate terms. The Scott County player is close to accurate because the vast majority of the people were either loyalists from Scott County or a little bit of people from the outside who would come in and join the Home Guard or that short-lived Union regiment. So, and it also means that I'm calling it a Scott County player, but there were people who were members of the Confederacy or, seceding from the Union guerrillas in Scott County. There were a limited number of those people. So that's not really right, but it's pretty close. And then certainly on the other side, the Confederate player is not just the Confederacy. It's also, as I said, guerrillas who were pro-secession from the Union, aligned with the Confederacy. So those are the sort of two sides. And I call them, just to oversimplify things, Scott County and Confederacy, because I think most people kind of can mentally wrap their head around that. In the historical document, though, that I wrote to go with the game, I mean, it gets really confusing really fast, right? When you're talking about, again, secessionists, who are you talking about? So I tried, and maybe, the document probably needs a fresh look specifically for that language. I tried to be as consistent as possible as I was about the language. I mean, one way to think about it is there's only one group of loyalists, right? There is no such thing as loyalty to, I guess, unless you talk about people from Scott County who were aligned to Tennessee after Tennessee had seceded, in which case they were loyalists to Tennessee. It gets super confused, but yeah, it is very difficult language to try to parse. And then, and I know you've talked about this before, complicating things even further is there's not a lot of Union units recognized or represented or talked about in the game, a little bit here and there. But of course, you have all the complicating factors of military units from Kentucky, Tennessee, et cetera, that which side are you talking about they're aligned to, and et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, there's a whole like layer to be like, which Fourth Kentucky is this?
Yes,
Is this the
yes.
Union Fourth Kentucky or the Confederate Fourth Kentucky or the
yeah.
And there's even like the names ones. There's a Union Irish Brigade and a Confederate Irish Brigade as well, and they sometimes fight each other, and it's all like messy. But I think that the terminology complexity is just baked into the American Civil War. Like it's from its start. Like the argument is that the Confederacy says they are legally left the Union and that they have seceded. That's what acknowledging secession is, and that this is a war between two nations. And then obviously the stance of the American government, who we call the Union, right, which is also a weird thing to do. Like that's something that Ty Sladeduel makes a really good point about in Robert E. Lee and Me, where he talks about like, we don't call the Union Army the American Army. We don't talk about it like that's a war that America fought, right? Like it's not the most U.S. military casualties in any conflict came from the Confederacy. We don't talk about it like that, We talk about the Union, and their concept of suppressing a rebellion and the War of the Rebellion, and like calling it the Civil War is almost like a mild compromise position that the North kind of wins, because the South prefers like war, or the Confederates preferred war between the states, or much worse ones. So like it is an interesting kind of a tricky thing, when you start getting into like, well, what do you call these people? And every decision about what to call them, like it is a decision. It says something about how you view the history and what your message you're trying to convey. Like if you use which name you use, if you're using Union as opposed to saying U.S. Army, like that says something different about your own priorities. And I think, loyalism is an interesting choice for that, because it does emphasize loyalty instead of calling them like anti-secessionists or something, which would be a mouthful, but you could have also called them that, right?
Sure.
Or you could have just called them Union soldiers, which would be inaccurate in a completely in a whole different way. So it's an interesting kind of path to have to wander down about like, well, what do you call these people? And what would they have called themselves? Well, they probably weren't thinking about that, like what kind of names to give themselves. They were just thinking about getting those Rebs off their goddamn farm.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think, in retrospect, I'm pretty sure, I have to go back and read it. I'm pretty sure I was fairly consistent, at least in the historic document, where I'm not trying to parse gameplay language, in referring to them as loyalists. And that was certainly intentional, right? Because from my perspective, that's the thing that mattered most, is that they were loyal to their country. Or they wanted to be. Yeah.
Loyalists is also an interesting one, though, because, I mean, this is like the weird Virginian in me, right? Because, like, in Virginia, certainly in Central Virginia where I grew up, like, there's the Civil War is really baked into the culture, right? And then, like, a lot of that is the kind of wider discussions of lost cause. And part of that is just, like, literally the landscape, right? Like I grew up 40 minutes from Chancellorsville. It's just there, right? All of that sweet Civil War shit is all around you all the time. The schools are named after it. When I was a Boy Scout, we were the Stonewall Jackson Area Council, and we had a big Stonewall Jackson patch on the arm, right? They've changed that now, but only like 5 years ago. So like all that stuff is just there. But at the same time, right, we're the state of the Revolution as well. Like for the first 5 U.S. presidents are Virginians. The city I grew up in is where Thomas Jefferson lived, so obviously Declaration of Independence, all that kind of stuff. And so loyalist also has that revolutionary connotation, right? Where a loyalist was loyal to the British crown.
Right, sure.
Right? Not a revolutionary. And then that's kind of got this like negative idea. So when you say like loyalists, you could almost I could almost see somebody like referring to someone like Scott County as loyalists derogatorily, right?
Oh, sure.
Like obviously like, the rebellion was good and we are the rebels and loyalists are traitors kind of thing. Which it's like an interesting, that kind of the way that word has carried over.
That's a good point. And the other word you'll hear is unionists, right? You'll hear people refer to, them referred to as unionists, Southern unionists.
Yeah. Or scalawags, as we call
them.
Really ruined that term for me when I realized that scalawag is just a Southerner who supported like equal rights to Black people, and I was like, this sucks.
Yeah,
scalawag is such a good insult, and here I found out that it's just racist. It's brutal. A rough day for us all. But yeah, of course, Meander Mike brings up West Virginia, the scar on my home state. Yeah. West Virginia, the one that successfully broke away and became its own state, and unlike East Tennessee, which never quite managed to split despite various efforts to kind of form. And part of that being just the lack of Union military presence until really late in the war in the state. And also West Virginia is a lot bigger. So it had that going for it.
But I mean, there were historical efforts by East Tennessee, even prior to the Civil War, to split off and be its own, its own state.
Yeah, and it's an interesting kind of thing because West Virginia is so famous, but obviously there are quite a few of these others. And East Tennessee is kind of the next biggest one, but obviously there's like little enclaves in northern Alabama and a few other places in the South where there's not really much of a slave population, and people just like don't see this as a good idea. This whole war thing might not go well for everybody. So to kind of hopefully Mark can stop his timer, and we'll probably return to technical terminology later, I'm sure. But so researching this game, I mean, you're not really famous for your American Civil War designs, and as we've discussed, you kind of stayed away from it. So like, how was it jumping in to learn about something, especially something that's as big and messy and with so much stuff on it as the American Civil War? It's something that I personally find incredibly intimidating about it as a topic. Like, my background academically is medieval history, and I look at the American Civil War and I'm like, oh fuck, there's a lot of books.
Well, so that is true specifically about the Civil War, but it's true for me about everything. Like I definitely struggle with like imposter syndrome, and do I have the credibility to do this, etc., with everything I work on. And so it's fortunate for me that I do love these like hyper niche, really specific topics, because that's it from a practical perspective. I feel like I'm able to dig really, really, really deep in a topic. Like, I can talk now extensively about, Scott County, Tennessee, or East Tennessee in the Civil War, but at the Civil War at large, I still can't. Like, I still probably the vast majority of war gamers in general know way more than I do. And so, if I was to have to design a strategic level Civil War game, I would just say I'm not going to do it. Right, because it's just I could never achieve the level of like knowledge and mastery on the topic that I would feel comfortable making that game. So, but for something like this, where the actual there's almost no real like published secondary sources on the topic, it just makes it, I mean, just honestly just easier to become sort of like familiar enough with the topic to be able to feel comfortable designing in that space.
Yeah, there's a lot to be said for microhistory in that regard. Like, you can really dig in, and if the pool of sources is something that's more manageable, then yeah, it's a lot easier to kind of get yourself up to speed, because in many of these cases there's more material than any human being could get through in a single lifetime. So you have to like pick your little niche, or accept a certain level of not knowing, or a real reliance on the works of others, which in something like the Civil War can become very difficult, because that works of others is huge.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And there's benefits to, like, I mean, American Civil War, because it's so widely produced and it's so widely researched and popular in it. And if you're based in America, the records are in America, has the benefit of like, okay, a lot of the material is accessible, right? Which is a little bit of a double-edged sword. Like, it's great that like the official records of the rebellion are really accessible, that you can like get any of them anytime and stuff, and you can dig into that primary source material. But also, a lot of that primary source material is incredibly difficult in ways that you might not immediately recognize if you haven't done a bit of baseline reading. I think something that I think is really interesting, people don't know about the official records of the rebellion, by the way. They're a really interesting treasure trove of documents that were put together, I think, starting during the end of the war, like in 1864, 1865, and carrying on through 1901. They were made by an act of Congress originally to order to assemble these. It's full of letters and diaries and records and all these things about the rebellion. And it's like 70 volumes in its final edited form. I think it's huge and really useful collection of documents. And you can like get an ebook of it for incredibly cheap, if not find an online free one. They redid the index in like the 70s or 80s, which is much better, or maybe more recently, to make it much easier to find stuff in it as well. But it's also a little bit of a thorny thing, because it was being made in the living memory of the war and by many people who were participants. So there's a certain amount of like burnishing their reputation in it, and like it's not being made by academic editors, it's being made by people who are participating. So the level of editorial control isn't great. So it's a great source of documents, but also some of the shit in there is just not true, and it's messy. And then also, even with all that work, there is an extended set of documents published in North Carolina in the 90s that was like stuff that wasn't in the OR, and that's 100 volumes long. So that gives you an idea of like how much material there is on the American Civil War. Is that these two things are 170 volumes long. They're still not really everything. There's still stuff that's not in them. It's like that's, you know, multiple lifetimes of research you could put into it, and it's one of the reasons why it's great that there are other people who do some of this research for you. But also, if you pick something narrow like Scott County, you know, you don't necessarily have that benefit of lots and lots of rigorous research, but also the source material pool is much smaller.
Yeah.
And also, like, in Scott County, you don't have to worry as much necessarily about the like having the power to change their reputations, right? Like when you're dealing with famous generals and stuff, their ability to make records change was much greater than some guy in Scott County, Tennessee. Right?
Yeah, and it's I mean, from a practical perspective, like, so take the ORs, right? So if I was doing some operational battle or something, you know, the amount of OR information from across the ORs would probably be, it would have taken a lot more research in that specific set of text, right? But I think I only wound up referencing like 3 or 4 because there was so little. I mean, there were the occasional correspondence between Confederate generals when they were talking about putting down some of the uprisings in Scott County. But I think there was literally like 2 pieces of correspondence from that one colonel who had established the regiment in Scott County, the short-lived regiment. I think it was like establishing it, and then like when they had lost the battle that they engaged in, and that was it. I mean, that's like the entire record, you know, reference within the OR of Scott County. So it makes at least that, you know, that those sorts of sources a lot easier to manage. Now, the flip side to that was, because there's not a lot of secondary sources published, almost none, it means getting anything is really challenging. So when I started the research, I would find like references to these books, these books that came out of Scott County, almost all written by people from the county, and they were literally like almost impossible to find. So like I remember one was written by this lady. I kept looking for it. I would find occasionally across the entire U.S. there were like 2 or 3 libraries that had it in their collection. Every time I tried to get it through interlibrary loan, which is almost always successful, Ohio has a really good interlibrary loan agreement. No library would send it to me, and so I'm like, well, what's the deal here? And eventually, I had to travel to Scott County and go to the Historic Society to get a hold of these books. And the reason why is because these books are basically just PDFs that the Historic Society will print out if you go there, and you can buy them. But I mean, and they're, like I said, they're written from people in the county, so they're not really books, right? These are like, you know, I mean, like history teachers writing it from their perspective, etc. So, getting a hold of those, I have pretty high confidence that I have the largest collection of books about Scott County outside of Scott County now in the U.S. probably, but
that sounds much more like the level that I'm used to working at for this kind of stuff. For like, if you're reading like medieval material, it's like, what do you have? We have this letter. Does it tell you anything useful? No. It's just like, I won a battle. Where'd you win it? Near this town. Like, thanks, buddy. I'm always so like, when I look, I'm both like jealous and like relieved when I look at modern material sometimes, when I'm like, you have a detailed order of battle? That's amazing. But also, you have to like parse that. That sounds like hell. I just have a list where some guy says, I think there were 7,000 people there. And you're like, okay, sure. Does that sound reasonable? I'm not sure. Right? And then you'll have one guy who's like, there were 6,000 people there versus 5,000 people. And you're like, cool. And this guy says there were 80,000 versus 150. And you're like, interesting. One of these is wrong.
Yep. Yeah.
So yeah, it's fun, but also it's a little bit tragic.
Yeah.
I did realize I passed over something. Oh, you keep going first.
Well, I was just going to say the one similar thing I will say about this, and some of this did appear in the OR records. And I know everybody deals with this, but it was laughable sometimes, the difference, because the skirmishes in the county, we're talking like 20 people, right? I mean, we were talking like really small. And so what you would have oftentimes is like a proper Confederate military unit coming in to you know, stamp down some of these Scott County rebels, and they would be like ambushed or something. And so but they would report back the size of the Scott County rebellion was just massive, right? It was like this huge organized rebellion, And it was like, okay, man, come on. You know, this is clearly massively blown out of proportion. But you would have reports from both sides where one person was killed or like 50 people were killed. It's like, so what's the truth? And the answer is no idea. And they're probably both exaggerating in both directions, right?
Yeah. That's history. It's fun.
Yep.
I did realize I got this off my shelf because I did want to mention it, but I wanted to mention it back when we were talking about loyalism and all of that. But I wanted to plug a book from like 50 years ago. Robert Penn Warren's The Legacy of the Civil War. People might recognize Robert Penn Warren as the first poet laureate of America. He wrote All the King's Men, which is a great book, highly recommended. Also, very famous poet. He is from Kentucky. He's from the Kentucky-Tennessee border, although he's kind of Western Kentucky, so not near Scott County, but he's in that kind of strip along the border is where he grew up. And this is something, it was originally an essay he wrote around the centenary of the American Civil War that he expanded into a book. And it's a lot about just like living with the American Civil War and memory. It's not history, right? Like this is personal reflection and thoughts on like the memory of the Civil War and its legacy in America, written by someone who grew up in the South and very close after the post-war generation, right? Like he's was born in like the 1910s, I think. So or maybe the 1900s. So he's like very close to the war in the way like the previous generation was fought it, basically. So it's a really interesting, and it's very short. Like it's a little kind of essay more than a book. But an interesting read and an interesting reflection on kind of Southern relationship to the war. And I think there's a lot of interesting writers from that period who wrote things. Also, it's also a very famous William Faulkner quote about Pickett's charge that gets circled around a lot. I don't know if you know it, but I can't remember it off the top of my head, but it's like every Southern boy can at like any time close his eyes and picture himself. And it's the 3rd of July, and he's he's just about to go, the order hasn't been given, that kind of thing. And it does really encapsulate, it's meant to be kind of ironic as well, but it really encapsulates that certain mindset of like reliving the war and the memory and that kind of way it baked into Southern white society and certain aspects of Southern white society. So it's very interesting. I suppose another kind of loyalism that we didn't talk about, and this is something that I think also connects, it's not so much loyalism, but another interesting lane that I wanted to dig into a bit, and it only kind of relates to the game, but a large number of Southerners who fought for the Union were, of course, former slaves, right? Talk about the U.S. colored troops, as they were known at the time. Some of them were recruited from the North, and participation actually among like able-bodied people from the North, like freed blacks, was very high, but there weren't that many of them. So most colored troops were liberated slaves from the South, from Virginia and from Louisiana and places like that. But they tend to also be erased from these discussions about it's kind of, I don't know if it makes sense to call them loyalists, because in a sense, like they're not really like loyal to the Union in a sense. They're more kind of like fighting for their own freedom and for their own future, because obviously the Union hadn't really done anything for them before now. But it's an interesting thing, and I thought it was something that struck me when obviously Scott County had very few slaves, but it didn't have no slaves. And I do think it's interesting in a way that like that's something that is basically very difficult to access. Like what did those people think about this experience is something that I think is essentially absent from the historical record and largely unknown. But I don't know if you had any thoughts about that as you were digging into it, like, you know, what that was like.
Well, yeah. So like you said, there's like literally nothing that I found written from from a slave's perspective about what was going on in Scott County. There were almost none. Depending on the sources you read, there were maybe up to 20 in the county. Like in the years leading up to it, there were maybe as much as 20, and then like during the war, those numbers got a lot fewer and fewer. I went back and read through a lot of the legal documents at the time, trying to piece together the number of slaves and which families they were associated with, just to try to get an objective view of the actual numbers. And it wasn't clear, but what was clear is that there were a couple of different authors from Scott County who were writing about the topic, who it read to me as if they were trying to present the numbers from two different perspectives. One that was showing there were fewer than a smaller number, and one that was showing a larger. Bottom line, there's somewhere around probably 10 to 20 slaves in the county. In terms of like, I know this isn't the question you're asking, but just in terms of the perspective of the non-slave people, the free people of the county, of the slaves, that was also pretty mixed. Like you had some people who were anti-slavery, like very much, like there was a Welsh farm owner who was like staunchly anti-slavery, had a pretty prominent position. There were some of the home guard who were pilots who were trying to sneak people into Kentucky. They were also very vocally anti-slavery. There were people who had slaves who freed them on their own accord during this period. So it kind of runs the gamut. But certainly, again, like in general, the topic of slavery was not something that was a major topic for the county. Now, to answer your actual question, all we really know is that the number of there was basically almost no black people left in the county after the Civil War. It's pretty clear from the writing that they weren't really welcomed there. And that is, I want to be very careful now about how I continue from this point on. But like, there was one of the authors, I'll just try to quote her rather than give an opinion on this. But she essentially wrote that after the war, there were things like billboards that were put up like, black people are not welcome here, right? So this is what I said about like trying to make sure that people don't get the wrong idea that this is not a game about people that lived in Scott County that were fighting against Tennessee to support, the sort of like anti-slavery movement. That's not what this is about. Some of those people felt that way, but that's not the overwhelming belief of the people. But unfortunately, we have literally no records of the actual experiences and perspectives of the slaves living in Scott County at the time. Not that I could find.
Yeah, it's really interesting and really frustrating, but very typical for that. Like it's something that David Blight's book Race and Reunion goes in a good bit to the ways in which, like, loads of collections of like remembering the war. In particular, there was a very popular newspapers would publish like stories from veterans about like their experience in the war, and like not really full memoirs. They'd be like short pieces about like what you remembered or what famous general thought about certain day or whatever. And very typically, there's basically no black people in it at all, right? Yeah. Like, and some of that's like kind of institutional in the sense that like their literacy rates were incredibly low. Obviously, they weren't like people weren't teaching slaves to read and write particularly. It was actually illegal in most of the South. And so, and post-war, it wasn't like suddenly they were getting great education. So that was kind of remained endemic. But also it was part of their policy that they just weren't as interested in publishing that material. So a lot of that was gone. There's also Kevin Levin wrote a book, Remembering the Battle of the Crater, which talks about the Battle of the Crater, which is this really interesting and weird battle during the Siege of Petersburg. But then he writes a lot about, the book carries on after that and talks about like the memories impacting the community and what like the people of Petersburg felt about the battle over decades and years, basically through the Civil Rights Movement, and like the ways in which it became a commemorative site for Union and Confederate soldiers. But it's one of the big engagements that U.S. colored troops fought in, and the ways in which they are erased from the narrative, and that the local black community was erased from discussions and from commemoration and stuff. And it's a really interesting way in which, like those stories were not ever written down in the same way that they were for their white counterparts. And so we obviously don't have a lot of the official stuff, and then we don't have that kind of memoir reminiscence, which it's really frustrating. Yeah. I had another point I was going to meander into there as well, but I've forgotten what it was. So let's move on.
I will say that as we were talking, there was a survey that was conducted, and I'm only vaguely remembering the details now. It no longer exists, but there used to be a bank in Scott County that they would support the publishing of a local newspaper. It was like a monthly or a bi-monthly newspaper that would come out that had a historical focus, and it was one of the main sources I used. And there was a survey that had come out at some point, and they republished the results of that survey, where they were interviewing people who had lived during the Civil War. And I believe that one or two of the questions were asking about the experience of slaves or black, I forget exactly how they phrased it, people in Scott County, the interactions of people in Scott County with the slaves from the county. And I can't remember exactly the specifics. There were no slaves or black people interviewed for it. So it was sort of like the opinions and thoughts of the people of the county about slavery. So I can dig back into that, but again, it's not the opinion of the actual people who had to experience it, though, and that's the problem.
Yeah. I do think that's something, though, that we're seeing. There's a lot more interesting. This is actually, I remember what I was going to say. There's a lot more interesting scholarship being done in this area now. Like, I mean, talked about Levin's book, but also the book that won the Pulitzer for history last year. I believe it was that one, was about, I can't remember the author now, which is very annoying, but it was about Harriet Tubman and the Combahee River Raid.
Oh, right. Yeah.
It's a big river on the East Coast to liberate a bunch of plantations.
That's an awesome story.
Yeah. I haven't read the book yet because I have too many books to read, but it's meant to be an amazing book. And it's a really interesting story that is the kind of thing that I think we're seeing more consideration of, like, well, what was the experience like for the enslaved and for slaves? And then as well, I think, to get to your point about them not fighting for, like, the white Southerners necessarily fighting for the slaves, right? Like, they have different motives. I think Elizabeth Varon's book, Armies of Deliverance, is a really interesting full war. Like, we're talking high level history of the whole war, but a way that she frames the deliverance in that initially is delivering their white, like the Northerners delivering their white cousins sort of concept from the South, from the tyranny of slavery. The idea is that, like, slavery is ruining their culture and that we will free them from it. So it's still very white focused, right? And only later do we begin to see this emancipation idea come into it, and then it never really takes hold as much as this other ideas of deliverance. And so it really frames that, like, some people were fighting for emancipation and for equality and for freedom for Black people, but, like, a lot of people were not, right? And the union and those ideas did really reign supreme for a lot of people, and that's really interesting. Let's pivot dangerously close to talking about the game now. I am also aware that we can't go for too long because Fred will have to come on and talk to Paolo Mori, and as little as I regard Fred, we do have to let Paolo talk.
Yeah, Paolo's amazing. Fred. Man.
Yeah. So this is a game about small-scale guerrilla warfare, something we talked a bit about before. It's not very common in Civil War games. How did you find, like, adapting mechanisms to that, and how did, like, you pair, like, this kind of difficulty, we say, of pinning down any kind of detail into something that, like, someone can play, as opposed to, like, a weird conference paper where you're like, I don't really know anything. This is all just gibberish.
Yeah. So, that was the interest. There were two interesting things about this. For one, the topic that we've just discussed, right? Sort of the loyalism or unionism, whatever you want to call it, in the South. Like, I wanted to tell that story. But I also was interested in just guerrilla warfare in the Civil War period. So this was a really cool combination to explore. So while I was doing the research for the game, the historical research for the game, it was, like, in the back of my mind. Now, one thing I never do game design until the research is complete. So I do all the research, and then I have this sort of, like, modeling phase where I kind of deconstruct the concepts that I want to make sure that appear in the game, and then I start the game design. But no matter how deliberate and, like, you want to be with that process, there's always stuff kicking around. And so when I was like, okay, how do you model guerrilla warfare in a game? And there's just 40,000 ways to approach it. Some of the things that immediately came to mind was, like, maybe it can be a block war game. I love simultaneous written orders games. There's not many of them. I love them. That was a definite, that kind of was where I was leaning towards starting. Basically just obfuscating where troops are and what their strength are, right? What their strength is for each of the units. But I was playing A Few Acres of Snow with my main local wargaming buddy. He had never played it before, and it's one of my all-time favorite games. Certainly one of my biggest influences, period, in game design. We were playing it, and I started thinking that A Few Acres of Snow does an extremely good job, not necessarily intentionally. Maybe Martin, that's what Martin Wallace wanted to do, but it does a really good job of, like, modeling these abstractions of where your pieces are located aren't necessarily, like, it's not clear what exactly is there. Is it a big military unit? Is it what presence or control represents isn't super clear. And certainly you've got no idea of, like, the actual troop strength in any given location, because it's all a bunch of cards that are somewhere in your deck, right? Whether your discard pile, your hand, whatever. And so I thought, that really is actually a good way to represent guerrilla warfare, because your presence on the board doesn't necessarily mean you're there, doesn't mean you control it, just means you were present there most recently out of the two sides. And your given strength at any location is totally obfuscated. And so the game borrows heavily from A Few Acres of Snow in a couple of ways in terms of like how you're moving around on the board, but also using cards. But it goes one step further. You play cards face down and then you reveal them. So there's like a bluffing and a bunch of feinting and stuff. So the game definitely uses that combination to represent the massive uncertainty for guerrilla warfare. And in this case, like I said before, we're talking like 20 guys fighting 20 guys. You really have it's like you're not watching troop movements anywhere. The only exception to that is the game also does a really good job when the Confederate player is building a big actual Confederate Army powerhouse that's coming to get you. The Scott County player knows it. They know they've acquired those cards. They know that they're coming through the deck, and they actually have to trace supply, which is like a much more structured approach, and they're much more vulnerable to attack from the Union player because of those supply rules. So that's the approach I took. I mean, like I said, there's a million ways to approach it. You know, none right or wrong, but that seemed to hit the sort of like right mark in terms of you never have an idea of where either side's guerrillas really are at any given point.
Yeah, well, it's really interesting kind of problem to have to solve. It is something I think to veer dangerously again towards actually talking about games is something that I wish I would like to see more of in American Civil War games. That idea of the uncertainty of knowledge and the difficulty of knowing where anyone is. In particular, like I read a lot about the battles that happen near me. Like, I mean, the Chancellorsville, of course, but more so, like I really like the Wilderness. I think that's probably the one I'm most interested in. Both of those are chaotic battles that happen in the woods. People don't know where the hell the other enemy are, and the Wilderness has instances where like the two armies camp basically next to each other and don't actually know because they just are so out of position that they don't actually even think to put out pickets to know that the other guy is like literally just like 100 yards that way, and it's just like chaos. And there's no way to do that in like a classic hex encounter. Much as I love a classic hex encounter, when you just got everybody on the board, it's like, well, I know where everybody is. So like, I'm never going to have that moment where it's like, I stumble out and suddenly there's an entire goddamn corps here that I thought was somewhere else. It is a huge challenge.
Yeah. And even if you do it, I mean, you can try to create that uncertainty and obfuscation and stuff with hex encounter or blocks or whatever. But it winds up, in my opinion at least, it just winds up being a lot of administrivia and just burden to try to maintain all of that, you know, extra pieces and fake pieces and all of this stuff to try to create that uncertainty.
Yeah, double blind is like a really cool idea. And then in practice, it's incredibly difficult to make a fun game with unless you go like full Kriegspiel. And you basically have a dungeon master who's like in charge of telling you what's going on. Then that works great.
And that's awesome. But I mean, that's totally impractical, right? That's the problem.
That's a different game.
Yeah.
I did once go to a really great, this is going to totally meander off topic, but I went to a really great event that a friend threw in his house once where he had 3 different rooms and we were all playing games in one of the rooms. I was playing Overlord Memoir 44, you know, the board smashed together big. I don't remember what scenario, but we were playing Overlord. Great game. Love Memoir 44. Shout out to Memoir 44. But he would burst into the room periodically. And we were playing a game, but then collectively we were a ship of Vikings. So he would like come in and he'd be like, okay, what do you guys do together? We have to stop playing the game. Like, okay, we're going to do this. We're going to raid here. And he'd be like, great. And he'd leave. And then he'd go into another room. And the other room was another ship of Vikings. And the other room was the local, you know, king who we were raiding. And it was great. It was a great time to just like have that multi-layered experience. So I highly recommend. Kriegspiels are great. And even like low budget Kriegspiel like that. Like if you go see the International Kriegspiel Society and they do cool stuff, but also you can just pen and paper and some friends who are prepared to make bad decisions. You can go nuts.
Yeah.
So it's really interesting. The guerrilla warfare thing, I think, is very interesting. And it does make me wonder what other things we could do to kind of model hidden movement and hidden information. Because I think we're really good at doing other forms of chaos in Civil War games. In particular, people not following orders, I think, is something that's done really well through like written order games. Mm-hmm. And also through like Blind Swords has great kind of chaos and its chit pull to just be like, people just aren't doing what the fuck you're telling them to do. Yeah. Which feels very universal, but you still have that knowledge of like where people are and what their strength is and stuff. Even with blocks, you can only hide some of that. Yeah. So it is something that I think would be interesting to see, but also, as you say, it's incredibly challenging. And so I think it'll be curious to see what inspiration Rebels Against Rebellion might bring with modifications to Fugger Snow, a game I have to confess I have never played, even though I always mean to.
It's a great game. I mean, the ones that came after it, Mythotopia, not really good. Handful of Stars was good, but like had some in-game problems. Not Handful of Stars.
Hands in the Sea.
Yeah, Handful of Stars. And then I was going to say Hands in the Sea is good. I enjoyed it. Not designed by Martin Wallace, and I forget the designers. I apologize. It's good. I just thought it was probably just a little bit more like chromy and gritty than it needed to be. And I just much more from a conflict historical perspective. I'm much more interested in A Few Acres of Snow time period. So I think it's a fantastic game. It's certainly, like I said at the beginning, one of the most influential. I came to wargaming pretty late. So A Few Acres of Snow was one of the first games I ever played. So it's definitely left a lasting impression. So it's kind of like, for me, it's also a fun little nod to that inspiration for me to have the opportunity to design this.
I remember when it came out, I was like really keen on it, but it was during a phase where I like didn't have people to play 2-player games with. I was playing a lot of miniatures war games, and like, so I played miniatures war games where I'd play like Euro games with like bigger groups of friends. Yeah. So I was that and Hammer of the Scots were on this like, oh, I would love to play this, but I don't have anyone to play this with. And they were both very expensive and hard to get in Ireland at the time. So it was real. And I was a broke PhD student. So it was like, am I going to spend like a lot of grocery money on a board game I can't play? So I never really got around to it, but I think it's on Yucata or one of those. I should really stop making excuses and play it.
It might be on BGA too. Mark Johnson and I have played it online somewhere. I can't remember where. But it's available somewhere online. I forget. If nothing else, on Tabletop Simulator. But there's a good online implementation somewhere.
Mark says Yucata. Yeah.
There you go. He knows.
To get over my Yucata trauma, I once started a game of Sekigahara against someone named Fred Serval, and it never got past the second turn because he just never took his turn. So that was a little traumatic.
My solution to that is I don't really play a lot. There you go. Mark and I have played a couple of times, and I know Mark's a big fan of it too. I don't really play async games online. So when I play with somebody, for me it's like it's being with the person playing the game, even if it's online. So it's always okay. Play real time. Just jump in Discord and play the game.
I play some async, but I do struggle with it, and I like Rally the Troops best for it because I find BGA too automated. And anyway, this is the old man chat now. Let's wrap up so that we don't make Paolo Mori mad with us.
Yes.
I believe you're co-designing with him, so we officially can't offend him. Now that we've got the David Thompson American Civil War game, obviously we all need to know, when's your Gettysburg game coming out? Like, when's the next David Thompson American Civil War masterpiece? I think we need another Gettysburg, or maybe an Antietam or something. What do you think?
If you can, so it definitely wouldn't be a Gettysburg game. So it would have to be some little tiny little thing that happened within Gettysburg that I could get real deep with. I don't know what that would be, but never say never, because I never thought I would make a Civil War game. So it's possible, but
maybe Combi River Raid. We'll announce it here.
So I have absolutely that would be cool. That I would definitely be down for.
Meandering Mike proposes Devil's Den.
Yeah. There you go.
Balloon Corps Gettysburg, or Balloon Court Chancellorsville. They some good balloon times.
Yeah. There you go. See, now we're talking. These are ideas.
Yeah. Now we're getting into the good stuff, the weird stuff.
The weird stuff. Yeah, that's right.
Okay, so let's wrap it up. Thanks for coming, David.
Yeah.
I don't think we've covered a lot of ground, and it's late here. And do you have another demo after this? Is there more? David Thompson?
I think I have one. Well, we're actually going to play. So before I did like a rules teach. So we're actually going to play like an actual demo of the game, and then that'll be my last formal thing. After that, I get to just sit in sessions and be a participant, which would be glorious.
Right.
But thanks for meeting with me. Thanks for agreeing to do this, and thanks especially for editing the companion book. I hugely appreciate it.
Yeah. Thanks for editing it. It was really good. It had footnotes and everything. Great to see. We will leave aside my rant about references and American Civil War rulebooks for a different conversation. Thanks everyone for listening. You guys should go. You should either stay for Paulo Mori or you should go play the game with David now. I mean, the Paulo Mori thing will be on YouTube later, so maybe you should go play the game. And if you are watching this and you haven't gone to SD Histcon and you just found it on Fred's YouTube channel, you should go to SD Histcon. It's on right now. I'm going to go to bed, but everyone else should go to SD Histcon. Okay. Thanks, awesome. Everybody.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.